Everyone expected Claire Whitmore to break at her mother's funeral. Nobody expected her to be the calmest person in the room. Rain tapped softly against the stained glass windows of St. Andrew's Church in Greenwich, Connecticut. Gray clouds hung low over the cemetery beyond the grounds, turning the afternoon into a wash of muted colors. Black umbrellas lined the stone pathway leading to the entrance. Luxury sedans filled the parking area. Business leaders, family friends, investors, and distant relatives moved quietly through the crowd, their voices lowered by grief and tradition. At the center of it all rested the polished oak casket of Eleanor Whitmore, one of the most respected businesswomen on the East Coast. Her passing had made headlines. Her influence had built fortunes. Her name carried weight in rooms most people would never enter. And today, everyone had come to say goodbye. Claire Whitmore stood near the back of the church, away from the cameras and away from the attention. At 35, she looked composed in a simple black dress and a tailored wool coat. Her blonde hair was pinned neatly behind her ears. Her hands remained folded in front of her. No trembling, no tears, no dramatic collapse, just silence. The kind of silence that came from carrying pain for so long that it no longer needed an audience. A few rows ahead, Daniel Brooks adjusted his tie and glanced over his shoulder. Even after 2 years apart, Claire recognized the expression immediately. Curiosity disguised as concern. He had always been good at that. Daniel stood beside a brunette woman several years younger than him. They looked polished together, comfortable, successful, the image he always wanted the world to see. The woman whispered something into his ear. Daniel smirked slightly before looking back toward Claire. Around them, conversations drifted through the church like soft currents. Poor thing. She lost her mother. I heard they were not close at the end. I cannot imagine what she is going through. Claire heard every word. She simply chose not to respond. The truth was far more complicated than anyone realized. For years, people assumed Eleanor Whitmore's daughter lived a life of endless privilege. The reality looked very different. Claire had spent most of her adult life trying to step out from beneath the shadow of her family's name. It had cost her opportunities, relationships, and eventually her marriage. The minister stepped to the podium and began speaking about Eleanor's life. Stories followed. Achievements, charitable work, business accomplishments. People nodded. Some cried. Others smiled at old memories. Claire listened quietly. She remembered a different version of her mother. The woman who worked 18-hour days and still found time to help with school projects. The woman who taught her that dignity mattered more than status. The woman who could command a boardroom in the morning and bake cookies in the evening. Their relationship had not been perfect. Far from it. But love rarely disappeared simply because people disagreed. As the service continued, Claire felt eyes on her again. Daniel. She did not need to look to know. Eventually she did anyway. Their gazes met across the church. Daniel offered a sympathetic smile. The kind people gave when they believed they occupied higher ground. Claire looked away first, not because she felt defeated, but because she no longer had energy for old games. After the service ended, mourners slowly filtered outside. Rain still fell lightly over the cemetery. Black umbrellas opened one after another. The procession moved toward the burial site, overlooking a line of maple trees stripped nearly bare by autumn. Claire stood beside the grave as the final prayers were spoken. Wind moved through the branches overhead. The world felt strangely quiet. Beside her, relatives discussed travel plans and estate matters in hushed voices. Some tried to disguise their curiosity. Others made little effort. Everyone knew Eleanor Whitmore's estate would be substantial. Everyone knew lawyers would be meeting with the family afterward. And everyone had opinions about what would happen next. Daniel remained nearby, not close enough to seem inappropriate, not far enough to avoid being noticed. Claire almost found it amusing. Even now, he wanted a front row seat. He wanted to witness grief, disappointment, weakness, something that would confirm the story he had told himself about her. The story that she needed people to rescue her, that she depended on wealth, that she measured life through inheritance and status. He had believed that during their marriage. Apparently, he still did. As the crowd slowly dispersed, a silver-haired attorney approached Claire carrying a leather portfolio. "Miss Whitmore," he said respectfully, "the family gathering will begin at 4 o'clock. Claire nodded. "I will be there." The attorney hesitated before adding something else. "There are several matters your mother specifically requested be handled today." Claire studied his expression. Something in his tone felt unusual, deliberate, almost cautious. "What kind of matters?" she asked. The attorney glanced briefly toward the gathering crowd before returning his attention to her. "I believe it is best if everyone hears it together." Then he offered a polite nod and walked away. Claire watched him disappear into the sea of black coats and umbrellas. A cold breeze swept across the cemetery. Somewhere behind her, Daniel laughed softly at something his companion said. He sounded relaxed, confident, certain of how the day would unfold. Claire looked toward the gray horizon beyond the trees. For the first time since the funeral began, a small feeling stirred inside her. Not grief, not fear, something closer to curiosity. Because if there was one thing she knew about Eleanor Whitmore, it was this. Her mother never left important things unfinished. The Whitmore estate stood on nearly 12 acres overlooking Long Island Sound, its stone facade darkened by the lingering rain. By the time Claire arrived, the sky had begun to clear, leaving behind a cold silver light that settled across the grounds. Luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway. Valets moved quietly between arriving guests. Through the tall windows of the mansion, warm lights spilled into the fading afternoon. It looked exactly as it had for decades. Elegant, imposing, unchanging. Claire paused at the front entrance for a moment before stepping inside. The scent of polished wood and fresh flowers greeted her immediately. Family portraits lined the walls. Crystal chandeliers reflected soft golden light across marble floors. Nearly every memory of her childhood seemed trapped somewhere inside those rooms. Some were comforting, others were not. Voices drifted from the main sitting room ahead. Relatives had already gathered. Business associates stood near the fireplace, speaking in low tones. Distant cousins occupied clusters of leather chairs. Everyone appeared to be waiting for the same thing, the reading of Eleanor Whitmore's will. Claire removed her coat and handed it to an attendant. As she entered the room, several conversations stopped. Heads turned. Smiles appeared, some sincere, others carefully rehearsed. She recognized the expressions. People often became unexpectedly friendly when inheritance entered the conversation. Claire, her Aunt Patricia, approached immediately, impeccably dressed, perfectly composed, and carrying the same calculating smile she had worn for years. Patricia embraced her lightly. "How are you holding up?" Claire almost laughed at the question. Nobody asking it actually wanted the answer. "I am managing." Patricia squeezed her arm. "Your mother was extraordinary." "She was." Patricia nodded solemnly before glancing around the room. "This has been difficult for everyone." Claire followed her gaze. Most of the people present had not visited Eleanor in months. Some had not visited in years. Yet today they all seemed deeply invested in her memory. The irony was difficult to ignore. Across the room, Daniel stood beside his girlfriend, Melissa. They were speaking with two investment partners Claire vaguely remembered from years ago. Daniel noticed her arrival immediately. His expression softened into something resembling concern. He crossed the room carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. "I thought you might need this," he said. Claire accepted the glass politely. "Thank you." Daniel studied her face. "You are handling this surprisingly well." The statement sounded innocent enough, yet something beneath it felt familiar, as if he were still waiting for the emotional collapse he expected. Claire took a small sip of water. "There is no correct way to grieve." Daniel nodded. "I suppose not." Melissa joined them moments later. Younger, elegant, and clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "I am sorry for your loss," she said sincerely. Claire appreciated the honesty in her voice. "Thank you." Unlike many others in the room, Melissa did not seem interested in inheritance, family politics, or hidden agendas. She simply appeared human. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 4. Conversations gradually quieted. The silver-haired attorney from the cemetery entered carrying the same leather portfolio. Every head in the room turned toward him. Anticipation spread almost instantly. The attorney introduced himself as Michael Langford and invited everyone into the library. The room had always been Eleanor's favorite. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls. A massive mahogany desk stood near the windows overlooking the water. Leather chairs filled the space. Family photographs rested on side tables. It felt less like a legal proceeding and more like stepping into Eleanor's presence one final time. Claire took a seat near the back. Daniel sat several chairs away. Patricia positioned herself near the front alongside other relatives. Michael Langford opened his portfolio and arranged several documents neatly on the table. Silence settled over the room. The kind of silence people reserved for moments they believed might change their lives. "Thank you all for coming," he began. His voice was calm and measured. Mrs. Whitmore left detailed instructions regarding today's proceedings. Several relatives exchanged quick glances. Claire noticed fingers tightening around armrests, eyes narrowing slightly. Hope and expectation often looked remarkably similar. Michael continued, "Before discussing assets, I would like to address several personal requests left by Mrs. Whitmore." A flicker of disappointment passed across Patricia's face. Clearly, she preferred to skip directly to financial matters. The attorney ignored the reaction and began reading a series of charitable donations Eleanor had arranged. Hospitals, educational foundations, community programs. The list continued for several minutes. Some people shifted impatiently in their seats. Others checked watches. Claire listened quietly. Every donation sounded exactly like something her mother would do. Finally, Michael closed one folder and opened another. The atmosphere in the room changed immediately. Everyone sensed it. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Michael glanced toward Claire briefly before looking back down at the document. "The remainder of Mrs. Whitmore's estate," he said carefully, "will be discussed shortly." A faint smile appeared on Patricia's face. Daniel adjusted his tie. Melissa sat quietly beside him. The attorney paused. Then he added something unexpected. "However, before we proceed, there is one instruction Mrs. Whitmore insisted be followed without exception." The room grew still. Michael placed a sealed envelope on the table. Thick, cream-colored paper. Claire recognized her mother's handwriting instantly. Her heartbeat quickened. Around the room, curiosity deepened. Michael rested his hand on the envelope and looked at the assembled family members. Mrs. Whitmore requested that this letter be read aloud before anyone learns who inherits what. No one spoke. No one moved. Outside the library windows, the last light of day faded across the water. And somewhere deep inside, Claire suddenly understood that her mother's final plans were only beginning. The library seemed smaller after Michael Langford placed the envelope on the table. A few moments earlier, people had been thinking about assets, stock portfolios, vacation properties, and trust funds. Now every eye in the room rested on a single piece of cream-colored paper. The envelope looked ordinary, yet somehow it carried more weight than anything else in the Whitmore estate. Claire could not stop staring at her mother's handwriting. Elegant, precise, familiar. It was the same handwriting that had once appeared on birthday cards, school notes, and letters mailed during long business trips. Seeing it now felt like hearing a voice from another room. Michael adjusted his glasses and carefully broke the seal. The sound seemed unusually loud in the silent library. Around the room, relatives leaned forward. Chairs creaked softly. Someone cleared their throat. Nobody wanted to miss a single word. Michael unfolded the pages and glanced down. For a brief moment, his expression softened. Then he began reading. "If you are hearing this letter, it means I am no longer there to explain things myself." The room grew even quieter. Claire lowered her eyes. The words sounded exactly like Eleanor. Direct, calm, practical. Michael continued. "First, I would like to thank everyone who came today. Grief has a way of reminding us how precious time truly is. If I have learned anything during my life, it is that people matter more than possessions." Several relatives shifted uncomfortably. The statement was not what they expected. Michael turned the page. "I know many of you are curious about what happens next. That is natural. But before anyone learns what I am leaving behind, there are truths I would like remembered." Claire felt something tighten in her chest. Her mother had always chosen her words carefully. Every sentence served a purpose. Every pause carried meaning. Michael continued reading. "Success can create a dangerous illusion. People begin believing they know who deserves credit, who deserves opportunity, and who deserves respect. They judge lives from a distance. They mistake appearances for character." Across the room, Daniel adjusted his posture slightly. Claire noticed it immediately, not because he appeared guilty, because he suddenly seemed attentive in a way he had not been before. Michael read on. "During my career, I met thousands of intelligent people. Many were talented. Some were brilliant. Yet the quality I valued most was integrity, the willingness to remain true to yourself when no one is watching." A long silence followed. The words settled over the room like falling snow. Claire remembered hearing similar lessons throughout her childhood. Her mother repeated them often, not because they sounded impressive, because she believed them. Michael glanced briefly toward Claire before continuing. There is one person I would like to address directly. The room instantly became alert. Claire's heartbeat quickened. Claire. Hearing her name spoken aloud felt strangely intimate. Michael continued reading. You spent much of your life trying to prove that you could stand on your own. Sometimes I admired that. Sometimes it frustrated me. Most of the time, it did both. A few people smiled faintly. Claire looked down at her folded hands. Her mother understood her better than anyone ever had, even when they disagreed. Especially when they disagreed. Michael continued. There were moments when I wanted to make your path easier. Moments when I wanted to intervene. But I knew you would never allow it. You wanted your accomplishments to belong to you. Claire blinked slowly. Emotion threatened to surface. She kept it contained. Around her, relatives listened carefully. Many were hearing parts of Eleanor's relationship with her daughter for the first time. Michael read the next lines. You made mistakes. So did I. But I never stopped being proud of the woman you became. The room remained completely silent. Claire stared at the floor. For months before Eleanor's passing, there had been conversations left unfinished, questions left unanswered, regrets neither of them fully addressed. Hearing those words now felt both comforting and painful. Michael folded the first page and moved to the next. His voice remained steady. To everyone else gathered here today, I ask only one thing. Be careful when deciding who deserves your judgment. A few people exchanged uncertain glances. The atmosphere in the room had changed. Subtly, but undeniably. This no longer felt like a routine reading of final wishes. It felt like preparation, as though Eleanor was building towards something larger. Michael continued. I have watched people underestimate Claire for years. Some assumed she depended on family connections. Others assumed she failed because she chose a different path. Most never bothered learning the truth. Daniel's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Claire noticed that too. Michael read on. The truth is that strength rarely announces itself. Real strength is often quiet. It continues working when no one applauds. It remains kind when kindness is inconvenient. It walks away from easy answers and chooses dignity instead. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound came from the rain tapping softly against the library windows. Michael reached the final paragraph. He paused briefly before reading it aloud. Everything I am about to leave behind was built through decades of effort. But the most important thing I leave behind is not money. It is perspective. Character matters. Loyalty matters. Truth matters. And very soon, some of you may finally understand why. The last sentence lingered in the air long after Michael stopped reading. A strange silence followed, different from the silence before. Heavier, more expectant. Claire slowly lifted her eyes. Across the room, Daniel sat perfectly still. Even Patricia seemed unsettled. Michael carefully folded the letter and returned it to the table. Then he opened another folder. The thickest folder in his portfolio. Several documents rested inside. Legal documents. Estate records. Ownership papers. The room collectively held its breath. Michael adjusted the pages in front of him and looked toward the assembled family members. Now, he said quietly, we may proceed with Mrs. Whitmore's final instructions regarding her estate. And suddenly every person in the room understood that the real revelation had not happened yet. The silence inside the library felt almost tangible after Michael Langford opened the estate documents. Outside, evening settled across Long Island Sound. The last traces of daylight faded beyond the windows, leaving reflections of lamps and chandeliers shimmering against the glass. Inside, nobody seemed interested in the view. Every person in the room was focused on the attorney. Years of curiosity, assumptions, expectations, and private calculations had all led to this moment. Michael adjusted the first document in front of him. His movements remained calm and deliberate. The room, however, was anything but calm. Claire could feel the tension in every corner. Patricia sat perfectly upright, fingers interlocked tightly in her lap. Several distant relatives leaned forward in their chairs. Even people who tried to appear indifferent could not hide their anticipation. Daniel sat beside Melissa with one leg crossed over the other. Outwardly, he looked relaxed, but Claire noticed him adjusting his cufflink for the second time in less than a minute. A habit he always had when something mattered more than he wanted others to know. Michael began reading. In accordance with the final wishes of Eleanor Whitmore, Several personal gifts and charitable allocations have already been established. He reviewed a series of bequests, donations to hospitals, contributions to educational programs, financial support for local community organizations. The figures were significant, yet nobody interrupted. Everyone understood these were merely preliminaries. The real questions remained unanswered. Michael continued for nearly 10 minutes. Then he closed one folder and opened another. The subtle sound of paper turning immediately captured the room's attention. We will now address ownership interests and corporate holdings. There it was. The sentence everyone had been waiting to hear. Patricia's expression brightened almost imperceptibly. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat. Melissa glanced around the room, sensing the sudden change in atmosphere. Michael consulted the document. Mrs. Whitmore maintained majority ownership in Whitmore Capital Group, including all voting rights associated with her controlling interest. The company represented decades of work, real estate investments, financial holdings, private equity positions. It was the foundation of Eleanor's legacy. Everyone in the room knew its value. Michael paused briefly before continuing. After careful consideration, Mrs. Whitmore has directed that her controlling shares be transferred in their entirety to a single beneficiary. The room became perfectly still. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken, not because she expected anything, because she suddenly realized how much everyone else did. Patricia's gaze fixed on the attorney. One cousin actually stopped breathing for a moment. Daniel's attention sharpened visibly. Michael looked down at the page. Then he read the name, Claire Whitmore. For a second, nobody reacted. The words seemed unable to reach the room, as though everyone's mind required extra time to process what they had just heard. Then, the silence broke, not through speech, through expressions. Shock, confusion, disbelief. Patricia blinked repeatedly. One relative looked toward another as if waiting for confirmation. Daniel's face remained motionless. Yet Claire saw the surprise immediately. It appeared in his eyes before he managed to hide it. Michael continued reading as though nothing unusual had happened. This transfer includes 51% ownership of Whitmore Capital Group and all associated voting authority. A faint murmur spread through the room. 51%. Not a portion. Not a divided inheritance. Control. Complete control. Claire sat perfectly still. She barely heard the whispers around her. Her mother had never discussed this. Not once. Michael continued listing assets attached to the controlling interest. Properties, investments, corporate authority, strategic holdings. The numbers sounded almost abstract, too large to feel real. Across the room, Patricia finally found her voice. There must be some mistake. Michael looked up calmly. There is no mistake. Eleanor never mentioned anything like this. Mrs. Whitmore was not obligated to discuss her estate plans. Patricia's jaw tightened. Several other relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Daniel remained silent. That surprised Claire more than anything. Years ago, he would have immediately offered an opinion, a theory, an explanation. Today, he simply listened. Michael turned another page. In addition, all executive succession authority previously held by Mrs. Whitmore shall transfer to Claire Whitmore. Another wave of surprise swept through the room. Claire stared at the attorney. She suddenly understood why her mother insisted on reading the letter first. Eleanor knew exactly what reaction this announcement would create. Michael continued reviewing legal language while the room struggled to absorb the implications. Claire barely heard the details. Memories surfaced instead. Long conversations with her mother, disagreements about independence, arguments about responsibility, advice she often ignored. Through it all, Eleanor had apparently been making plans Claire never knew existed. The realization felt overwhelming, not because of the money, because of the trust. Finally, Michael finished reviewing the corporate provisions and set the document aside. A heavy silence followed. Most people still appeared stunned. Patricia looked as though she wanted to argue further, but lacked the evidence. Daniel stared at the table in front of him. Melissa looked quietly concerned. Claire folded her hands and took a slow breath. She expected the meeting to move toward smaller distributions next. Other inheritances, additional family arrangements. Instead, Michael reached into his portfolio once more. His expression grew noticeably more serious. The shift immediately captured everyone's attention. He removed a sealed manila envelope and placed it beside the original letter. Unlike the first envelope, this one contained several pages. Thick pages. Official pages. Michael rested his hand on top of it. There is one final instruction from Mrs. Whitmore that must be addressed before the remainder of the estate is distributed. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Michael looked around the room carefully. Then his gaze settled briefly on Daniel. Only for a second. But Claire noticed it. So did Daniel. The attorney took a slow breath. Mrs. Whitmore requested that these documents be read aloud immediately after ownership transfers were announced. A strange feeling settled over the room. Something deeper than surprise. Something closer to unease. Outside, darkness fully claimed the horizon. Inside, every person in the library suddenly understood that the inheritance was not the final revelation. It was only the beginning. The manila envelope remained untouched on the table for several long seconds. No one seemed eager to hear what came next, yet no one could look away from it either. The inheritance announcement had already changed the atmosphere in the library. What began as a gathering of grieving relatives now felt like something entirely different. The room was filled with questions. Why had Eleanor Whitmore left control of everything to Claire? What had she known that nobody else did? And why had she instructed Michael Langford to continue reading after the estate was settled? The attorney adjusted the envelope carefully. His expression remained professional, but there was something heavier in his eyes now. A sense of responsibility. As if he understood the impact of the words he was about to share. Outside, darkness pressed against the windows. Inside, the warm glow of antique lamps illuminated rows of books and family photographs. Claire noticed one picture resting on a nearby shelf. It showed her and her mother standing together on a sailboat nearly 10 years earlier. Both were smiling. Neither knew what the future would bring. Michael finally broke the silence. Several years ago, Mrs. Whitmore initiated a private review regarding matters she believed affected her daughter's personal and financial well-being. Immediate confusion spread through the room. Patricia frowned. Daniel's expression tightened. Claire remained still. She had no idea what Michael was referring to. The attorney removed several documents and placed them neatly on the table. Mrs. Whitmore instructed me to disclose this information only after her passing. He paused. She believed certain truths deserved to be examined without interruption. Nobody spoke. Michael continued. Approximately 7 years ago, concerns were brought to Mrs. Whitmore's attention regarding individuals seeking relationships with members of the Whitmore family, due primarily to financial expectations. Several people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Claire felt a strange sensation in her chest. She was beginning to understand where this was heading. Daniel sat motionless. Michael looked down at the documents. Mrs. Whitmore commissioned a confidential investigation conducted by a licensed private consulting firm. Patricia blinked. An investigation? Michael nodded once. Yes. The room grew quiet again. Claire remembered her mother's cautious nature. Eleanor trusted people, but she also verified what she trusted, especially when family was involved. Michael turned a page. The investigation revealed several individuals discussing potential personal and professional advantages associated with a relationship involving the Whitmore family. No names yet, just facts. Yet tension immediately filled the room. Daniel's jaw tightened. Melissa looked toward him briefly before returning her attention to the attorney. Michael continued. Most of these findings were considered insignificant and were never acted upon. Another page turned. However, one case received particular attention. The room seemed to shrink. Claire could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway beyond the library. Michael lifted his eyes from the document. Then he spoke carefully. The investigation included statements made by Daniel Brooks before his marriage to Claire Whitmore. Complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Daniel stared at the attorney. His face remained composed, but the color had begun fading from it. Claire felt her pulse quicken. Michael continued. According to documented interviews and verified communications, Mr. Brooks repeatedly discussed the financial opportunities that might accompany a future relationship with Claire Whitmore. Patricia's eyes widened. Melissa turned slowly toward Daniel. Across the room, several relatives exchanged stunned looks. Daniel immediately straightened in his chair. That is ridiculous. His voice sounded controlled, but only barely. Michael did not react. He simply continued reading. The investigation found multiple references to expected access, career advancement, business introductions, and long-term financial advantages. Claire felt as though the floor had shifted beneath her. For years, Daniel had accused her of caring too much about money, too much about status, too much about family wealth. The accusation had become one of the deepest fractures in their marriage. Hearing this now felt surreal. Michael opened another document. Mrs. Whitmore chose not to interfere in her daughter's relationship. She believed Claire deserved the freedom to make her own decisions. Claire lowered her eyes. That sounded exactly like her mother. Even when Eleanor suspected something, she rarely controlled outcomes. She preferred letting people reveal themselves. Michael continued. However, she requested ongoing monitoring of the situation. Daniel's expression darkened. This is absurd. No one responded. Not even Patricia. For the first time all evening, Daniel seemed isolated from the room around him. Michael reached the final page. Following the dissolution of the marriage, Mrs. Whitmore reviewed the findings one final time and included them among her personal records. The attorney carefully folded the document. Then he looked toward Claire. Mrs. Whitmore left a handwritten note attached to these findings. The room immediately became silent again. Michael unfolded a separate page. The handwriting was unmistakable. Eleanor Whitmore. He began reading. Claire, if you are hearing this, then I am no longer here to explain why I kept these records. The answer is simple. I wanted you to know that you were never the person they believed you were. Claire felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. Michael continued. For years, some people judged you through the lens of my success rather than your own character. They assumed your advantages defined you. They never bothered learning who you really were. The room remained frozen. Michael read the final lines. If there is one thing I hope you remember, it is this. The people who accuse others most loudly often reveal themselves in the process. You never chased money. You never chased power. You chased independence. And I was always proud of that. When Michael finished, silence settled over the room once more. Heavy, unavoidable. Daniel stared at the floor. Melissa sat quietly beside him. No one seemed interested in arguing anymore. The documents resting on the table had quietly reversed years of assumptions. And somewhere between the inheritance, the investigation, and Eleanor's final words, the story everyone thought they knew had begun to unravel. For several seconds after Michael finished reading Eleanor Whitmore's note, nobody spoke. The library seemed trapped inside a strange stillness. The kind that appears when a room full of people realizes a story they believe for years may have been wrong all along. The grandfather clock in the hallway continued its steady rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Each sound seemed unusually loud against the silence. Claire sat motionless. Her eyes remained fixed on the documents resting on the table. The inheritance no longer felt like the most significant revelation of the evening. What stayed with her were her mother's words. You never chased money. You chased independence. The sentence echoed in her mind. For years she had tried explaining that very thing. To friends. To relatives. To Daniel. Eventually she stopped explaining altogether. Some people only hear what confirms their assumptions. Across the room, Daniel remained seated beside Melissa. The confidence he carried earlier had disappeared. His posture had changed. His shoulders seemed heavier somehow. Not defeated, just burdened by something he could no longer ignore. Melissa quietly looked away from him and toward the windows. She appeared uncomfortable. Not angry. Not embarrassed. Simply caught in the middle of a truth she had never expected to witness. Patricia was the first person to speak. Eleanor kept all of this private? Her voice sounded smaller now. Michael nodded. Mrs. Whitmore was extremely deliberate regarding personal matters. Patricia glanced toward Claire. For once, she seemed uncertain what to say. Claire appreciated that. Silence felt preferable to forced sympathy. Michael carefully organized the remaining documents. There are still several portions of the estate to address. His professional tone helped restore some structure to the evening. Yet the atmosphere had permanently changed. The remaining inheritances suddenly felt secondary. Properties were distributed. Smaller investments assigned. Charitable foundations established. Family trusts reviewed. People listened politely, but the energy was gone. Nobody seemed focused on numbers anymore. The real story had already unfolded. Nearly 40 minutes later, Michael closed the final folder. That concludes Mrs. Whitmore's estate instructions. No applause followed. No dramatic reactions. Just a room full of people quietly processing what they had learned. Chairs shifted. Relatives stood slowly. Conversations resumed in cautious whispers. Some guests gathered their coats. Others lingered near the fireplace. Claire remained seated for a moment longer. She needed time, not because she felt overwhelmed by the inheritance, because she felt unexpectedly close to her mother. Eleanor had somehow managed to protect her one final time, even after she was gone. Eventually, Claire stood and walked toward one of the large windows overlooking the dark water beyond the estate grounds. Long Island Sound reflected scattered lights from distant boats. The rain had stopped completely. The night looked calm, peaceful. Behind her, the room gradually emptied. She heard footsteps approach, but did not immediately turn around. Somehow she already knew who it was. Daniel stopped several feet away. Neither spoke at first. The silence between them felt different than it once had. Less hostile, more honest. Claire finally turned toward him. Daniel looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally, like someone re-evaluating years of memories all at once. Claire. His voice sounded quieter than she remembered. She waited. Daniel looked down briefly before meeting her eyes again. I did not know about any of that. Claire believed him. That was the strange part. She truly believed he had never known Eleanor kept those records. Daniel exhaled slowly. But some of it is true. The admission hung between them, raw and uncomfortable. Claire remained silent. Daniel continued. When we first met, I knew who your family was. A faint bitter smile crossed his face. I would be lying if I said it never crossed my mind. The honesty surprised her. For years, every conversation about their marriage had turned into an argument. Defensiveness, blame, accusations. Tonight felt different. Daniel looked toward the library door. The problem is that somewhere along the way, I convinced myself you were the one obsessed with wealth. He laughed softly. The sound carried no humor. Maybe it was easier than admitting my own issues. Claire listened quietly. Outside, wind moved across the water. Inside, the last guests prepared to leave. Daniel shook his head. I spent years believing I understood you. His eyes lowered briefly. Turns out I never really did. Claire felt no satisfaction hearing those words. No victory. Only a strange sense of closure. Some wounds healed because justice arrived. Others healed because understanding finally replaced misunderstanding. We were both different people then, she said softly. Daniel nodded. Maybe. He hesitated. But you became a better version. For the first time that evening, Claire smiled. Not a triumphant smile. Not a sarcastic one. Just a genuine smile. Small and peaceful. Take care of yourself, Daniel. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once. You too, Claire. Without another word, he walked away. Claire watched him disappear through the doorway and into the long hallway beyond. Years earlier, she would have chased after explanations, demanded accountability, needed answers. Tonight, she felt none of that. The past no longer required her attention. Her future did. She turned back toward the window. Reflections danced across the dark water. Somewhere nearby, staff members began extinguishing lights throughout the estate. The house felt quieter now, almost resting. Claire slipped her hands into the pockets of her coat and looked out into the night. For the first time since her mother's funeral began, the weight in her chest felt lighter. Not because she inherited a fortune, not because the truth had finally emerged, because she no longer needed anyone's permission to know who she was. And as the lights of the Whitmore estate slowly dimmed behind her, Claire realized that Eleanor's greatest gift had never been the inheritance at all. It was leaving behind the truth. The following morning arrived with clear skies and a sharp coastal breeze sweeping across the Whitmore estate. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows that overlooked Long Island Sound, illuminating rooms that had felt impossibly heavy the day before. The funeral was over. The reading of the will was over. Most of the guests had returned to their own lives. Yet for Claire, everything seemed to be beginning rather than ending. She stood alone in her mother's library shortly after sunrise. The room smelled faintly of old books, polished wood, and fresh coffee. For the first time since Eleanor's passing, silence felt comforting instead of painful. Claire slowly moved through the room, her fingertips grazing the edges of bookshelves she had known since childhood. Everywhere she looked, traces of her mother remained. A framed photograph from a charity gala, a sailing trophy displayed beside family pictures, notes written in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting tucked between pages of business journals. The room felt alive with memory. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Michael Langford stepped into the library carrying a leather folder. Unlike the previous day, he looked less like an attorney managing an estate and more like an old family friend. I hope I am not interrupting, he said. Claire offered a small smile. Not at all. Michael approached the desk and placed the folder in front of her. There are several documents requiring your review over the next few weeks. Claire glanced at the thick stack of papers. I had a feeling this was coming. Michael smiled. Your mother was very thorough. That was perhaps the understatement of the century. Claire opened the folder and immediately saw pages related to Whitmore Capital Group, corporate structures, board appointments, investment summaries, responsibilities she now owned. The reality settled heavily upon her shoulders. Yesterday, she had inherited control. Today, she had to learn how to carry it. Michael took a seat across from her. There is something you should know. Claire looked up. His expression had grown more serious. Your mother spent the last 2 years preparing for this transition. Claire frowned slightly. What do you mean? Michael folded his hands. Many of the systems currently in place were designed with you in mind. Claire blinked. Me? Michael nodded. She believed one day you would lead. The words struck her harder than she expected. Throughout her life, Eleanor Whitmore had challenged her, questioned her decisions, and pushed her beyond her comfort zone. Yet hearing that her mother quietly believed in her all along felt unexpectedly emotional. Michael continued. She never doubted your ability, only your willingness to accept it. Claire laughed softly. That sounded exactly like her mother. They spent years arguing about responsibility, about privilege, about independence. Yet somehow Eleanor had been planning for this future the entire time. After Michael left, Claire remained in the library reviewing documents. Hours passed. The morning became afternoon. Sunlight shifted across the room. Gradually, the overwhelming stack of papers began transforming into something more manageable. A business, a responsibility, a legacy, not merely wealth. Across town, however, another person was struggling with the events of the previous day. Daniel sat alone inside a quiet corner of a waterfront cafe. A cup of untouched coffee rested in front of him. Through the window, sailboats drifted across the harbor beneath clear blue skies. Normally, he enjoyed places like this. Today, he barely noticed the view. Eleanor's letter replayed endlessly in his mind. So did the investigation. The findings. The uncomfortable truth that some of the things he once dismissed as harmless ambition now looked very different through the lens of hindsight. Daniel had spent years telling himself a story about Claire. A story that explained their failed marriage. A story that protected his pride. Now that story was collapsing piece by piece. For the first time, he found himself wondering how much pain those assumptions had caused. Back at the estate, Claire stepped onto the rear terrace shortly before sunset. The water beyond the property shimmered beneath the fading light. Seagulls drifted across the horizon. The world felt peaceful in a way she had not experienced for years. Her phone vibrated. A new email notification appeared. Board meeting request. Whitmore Capital Group. Monday, 9 a.m. Claire stared at the message. Beneath it were dozens more. Financial advisors. Executives. Investors. People suddenly eager to speak with her. Not because she was Eleanor's daughter. Because she now held the authority they once associated with her mother. The thought felt strange. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and looked toward the water. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, life was continuing exactly as it always had. Waves rose and fell. Boats crossed the sound. The sun slowly disappeared beneath the edge of the world. For the first time, Claire understood that inheriting her mother's legacy was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about deciding who she wanted to become next. And as the final light faded across the water, she realized that the most important chapter of her story had not happened yesterday in the library. It was waiting for her tomorrow. Monday morning arrived with a sky so clear it seemed impossible that only a few days earlier the Whitmore family had gathered beneath rain clouds and grief. Manhattan shimmered in the distance across the water as Claire's car moved steadily toward the headquarters of Whitmore Capital Group. The company occupied the upper floors of a glass tower overlooking Midtown, a building that reflected both sunlight and ambition in equal measure. Claire sat quietly in the back seat reviewing a folder Michael Langford had prepared over the weekend. Financial reports, board biographies, investment summaries. She had spent nearly every waking hour studying them. The more she learned, the more she realized how carefully her mother had prepared this transition. Eleanor had not left behind chaos. She had left behind a blueprint. Still, nothing could fully prepare Claire for what awaited her. When she stepped into the building lobby shortly before 9 o'clock, Conversations immediately softened around her. Employees recognized her. Security guards greeted her by name. Receptionists smiled warmly. The attention felt unfamiliar. For years, she had worked hard to avoid being defined by her family. Now her family had become impossible to separate from her future. An assistant escorted her to the executive floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of the city. Conference rooms lined the hallway. Men and women in tailored business attire moved efficiently between meetings. Everything felt polished, fast-moving, important. Claire understood why her mother loved this world. It rewarded preparation. It respected discipline. The boardroom doors opened precisely at 9. 12 directors sat around a long walnut table. Some were longtime allies of Eleanor. Others were newer additions. Every one of them studied Claire carefully as she entered. Not hostile, not welcoming, evaluating. The way experienced business leaders evaluated everything. Claire took her seat at the head of the table. The same seat her mother occupied for nearly 2 decades. For a brief moment, she felt the weight of it. Then she straightened her shoulders and focused. The meeting began. Financial updates, strategic reviews, market forecasts. One by one, executives presented information. Claire listened more than she spoke. She took notes, asked thoughtful questions, observed dynamics around the table. Several board members seemed surprised by her preparation. Others appeared relieved. As the hours passed, something shifted. Skepticism began giving way to respect. Not because of her inheritance, because she understood the business. By noon, the formal session concluded. Directors gathered their materials and prepared to leave. One of the senior board members, Robert Hastings, paused beside her. He had worked with Eleanor for nearly 25 years. Your mother would have been proud today. Claire smiled politely. Thank you. Robert nodded. You know, many people assumed she chose you because you were family. Claire waited. Robert smiled faintly. Those people clearly never attended one of your meetings. After he left, Claire remained seated for several moments. The compliment meant more than she expected. It felt earned. Across town, Daniel Brooks sat inside his office overlooking the harbor. His own company occupied a respectable building several miles away. Normally Monday mornings consumed him completely. Today he struggled to concentrate. Reports remained unread on his desk. Emails piled up unanswered. His thoughts kept returning to the library, to Eleanor's letter, to Claire. Eventually he opened a browser window and searched for Whitmore Capital Group. Financial articles filled the screen. Industry analyses, corporate announcements, market updates. Then he saw a newly published photograph from that morning. Claire entering headquarters. Professional, confident, composed. The accompanying article referred to her as the controlling shareholder and acting executive leader of the company. Daniel stared at the image longer than he intended. For years he had viewed Claire through the lens of their failed marriage. Now he was seeing something different. The person she had always been beneath his assumptions. Later that afternoon, Claire received an invitation from several senior executives requesting an informal dinner. They wanted to discuss future strategy, relationships, long-term goals. The invitation was expected, yet something else arrived with it. A handwritten note tucked inside a folder left on her desk. The handwriting immediately caught her attention. It belonged to Eleanor. Claire opened the folded paper carefully. The note was short, far shorter than the letter read in the library. It simply said, "If you are reading this, then you finally accepted the responsibility you spent years running from. Leadership is not about control. It is about service. Listen carefully, trust slowly, and remember that character always reveals itself with time." Claire smiled despite herself. Her mother somehow continued offering advice even after she was gone. As evening approached, sunlight reflected golden against the surrounding skyscrapers. Claire stood alone in the executive office that had once belonged to Eleanor. The city stretched endlessly below. Traffic flowed through crowded streets. People hurried between meetings, restaurants, and homes. Life continued. Yet everything felt different now. She glanced toward a framed photograph resting on the bookshelf behind the desk. It showed her mother standing on the same office floor years earlier. Confident, determined, unapologetically herself. Claire looked out across the skyline again. For the first time since the funeral, she felt something stronger than grief, stronger than responsibility, stronger even than vindication. She felt purpose. And somewhere in another part of the city, Daniel was beginning to understand that the woman he thought he knew was only now becoming visible to everyone else. The next several weeks moved with surprising speed. Days that once felt uncertain became structured around meetings, decisions, and responsibilities that demanded Claire's full attention. Every morning she arrived at Whitmore Capital Group before most of the executive team. Every evening, she left long after the city lights had begun reflecting across the glass towers of Manhattan. Yet despite the pressure, she found herself enjoying the work. Not because of the authority, not because of the title, because for the first time in her life, she felt aligned with a purpose larger than proving something to anyone else. The company was thriving. Several investment initiatives that Eleanor had quietly prepared were beginning to show results. Senior executives who initially questioned Claire's readiness now sought her input regularly. Investors responded positively to the stability she brought. One afternoon, nearly 6 weeks after the funeral, Claire stood inside a conference room reviewing projections with department leaders. The discussion was productive, energetic, focused. As the meeting concluded, one of the senior analysts lingered behind. "Can I say something?" he asked. Claire smiled. "Of course." The analyst adjusted the papers in his hands. "Everyone expected you to spend months trying to become your mother." Claire raised an eyebrow. "And?" He smiled. "You became yourself instead." The comment stayed with her long after he left. That evening, she remained in her office overlooking the city. Below, traffic moved through Manhattan like streams of light. The skyline glowed beneath the early winter sky. Claire found herself thinking about the past, about how much energy she had spent defending herself against assumptions. How many years she wasted trying to convince people she was not the person they imagined. Now she understood something important. People rarely change their minds because they are argued into it. They change because reality eventually becomes impossible to ignore. Across the city, Daniel was learning a similar lesson. The weeks following the reading of the will had not been easy. News traveled quickly in certain circles, particularly among business communities where reputation mattered. The details of Eleanor's estate remained private, but rumors spread anyway. Daniel noticed subtle changes in conversations. People asked different questions. They looked at Claire differently. Some looked at him differently as well. Not with hostility, with curiosity. Curiosity could be far more uncomfortable. One evening, after finishing a late meeting, Daniel stopped by a small restaurant overlooking the East River. The place was quiet. Warm lighting reflected off dark wood and polished glass. He ordered dinner and sat alone near the window. Halfway through the meal, he noticed a familiar figure entering the restaurant. Claire. She was accompanied by Michael Langford. They appeared to be discussing business. Daniel immediately considered leaving. Then he realized how ridiculous that would look. Instead, he remained seated. Claire noticed him moments later. Their eyes met briefly. To his surprise, she smiled politely. No tension, no resentment, just simple acknowledgement. Michael followed her gaze and recognized Daniel as well. The older attorney nodded courteously. A few minutes later, as Michael stepped away to take a phone call, Claire approached Daniel's table. "Mind if I say hello?" she asked. Daniel almost laughed. "It would be strange if you did not." Claire smiled and sat across from him for a moment. The city lights shimmered beyond the window behind her. For several seconds neither spoke. Yet the silence felt remarkably comfortable. Daniel finally shook his head. "You seem different." Claire looked amused. "Different how?" He considered the question carefully. "Lighter." Claire glanced toward the river. "Maybe I am." Daniel nodded slowly. He understood. More than she realized. The past few weeks had changed him as well. Not dramatically, not overnight, but enough. Enough to recognize how much bitterness he had carried. Enough to understand how often pride disguised itself as certainty. "I used to think your life was easier than mine," he admitted quietly. Claire looked genuinely surprised. "Why?" Daniel laughed softly. "Because it was easier than admitting I was comparing myself to you." The honesty caught both of them off guard. Claire did not respond immediately. She simply listened. Daniel continued. "I spent years believing I understood what motivated you." He looked down briefly. "I was wrong." Claire studied him carefully. There was no defensiveness left in his voice. No competition. Just reflection. She smiled gently. "We were both carrying things we should have let go of sooner." Daniel nodded. The statement felt true. More true than almost anything they had said to each other during the final years of their marriage. Michael returned moments later, ending the conversation naturally. Claire stood. It was good seeing you, Daniel. You too. She smiled one last time before returning to her table. Daniel watched her cross the restaurant. For the first time in years, he felt no desire to rewrite the past. No need to defend himself. No urge to prove anything. Some stories simply reached their ending. Outside, snow had begun falling lightly across the city. Tiny white flakes drifted through the glow of streetlights and reflected off the East River. Inside the restaurant, Claire resumed her conversation with Michael. Business plans, future opportunities, new responsibilities. Her future was expanding in directions she never anticipated. And as she looked through the window at the snow-covered skyline, she realized something her mother had understood all along. The most powerful transformations rarely happen when the world changes around you. They happen when you finally stop allowing the world to define who you are. Winter settled fully over New York by the time December arrived. The city seemed transformed by the season. Holiday lights stretched across avenues. Storefront windows glowed with elaborate displays. Snow occasionally dusted rooftops before disappearing beneath the constant movement of millions of people. Yet inside Whitmore Capital Group, the pace remained relentless. Markets never paused for the holidays. Investors never stopped watching. Decisions still carried consequences. Claire had learned that quickly. 3 months had passed since the funeral. 3 months since Eleanor's final letter altered the course of her life. During that time, something remarkable happened. The uncertainty surrounding Claire's leadership gradually disappeared. Not because people suddenly trusted her family name, because they trusted her judgment. The company had closed 2 major acquisitions. Internal restructuring efforts improved efficiency. Employee retention increased. Several analysts who once predicted instability now published reports praising the firm's direction. None of it happened overnight. It happened through hundreds of small decisions made consistently over time. On a cold Thursday morning, Claire arrived at headquarters before sunrise. The city remained dark beyond the glass walls of her office. She carried a cup of coffee and a folder filled with reports for an upcoming board meeting. As she stepped onto the executive floor, she noticed activity inside the main conference room. Several board members had arrived unusually early. Curious, she continued toward her office. A few minutes later, her assistant appeared at the door. "The board would like to see you before the meeting begins." Claire looked up from her desk. "Now?" "Yes." The assistant smiled in a way that suggested she knew something Claire did not. Claire set down her pen and followed her to the conference room. The moment she entered, she sensed something unusual. Every board member was present. Robert Hastings stood near the head of the table. Several others exchanged knowing smiles. Claire paused. "Did I miss something?" Laughter spread around the room. Robert motioned toward an empty chair. "Please sit down." Claire complied, though confusion remained written across her face. Robert folded his hands. 3 months ago, many of us had concerns. Claire smiled faintly. "That is a polite way of describing it." More laughter followed. Robert nodded. "Fair enough." He glanced around the room before continuing. "What matters is that you exceeded every expectation." Claire felt slightly uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. Praise had never come easily to her. Robert continued anyway. "You protected the company during a difficult transition. You strengthened operations. You earned the confidence of investors. Most importantly, you earned the confidence of this board." Several directors nodded in agreement. Claire looked around the room. For a brief moment, she saw not skepticism but respect. Genuine respect. Robert opened a folder in front of him. "Therefore, the board has reached a unanimous decision." Claire blinked. "About what?" "Hey." Smile spread across Robert's face. "Effective immediately, we are appointing you Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore Capital Group." Silence followed. Not the uncomfortable silence of uncertainty. The stunned silence that arrives when life changes direction without warning. Claire stared at him. For once, words failed her. Robert chuckled softly. "I realize this may come as a surprise." Claire laughed despite herself. "That is one way to put it." Applause gradually filled the room. Warm, genuine, unforced. Claire felt emotion rise unexpectedly. Not because of the title itself, because she understood what it represented. Years earlier, she spent enormous amounts of energy trying to escape assumptions attached to her family. Now she stood in the very position people once believed she could never earn. And she had earned it. Every bit of it. Later that evening, news of the appointment spread quickly throughout financial circles. Industry publications covered the announcement. Investors responded positively. Employees filled internal message boards with congratulations. Claire spent most of the day answering calls and attending interviews. By the time she finally left the office, the city was glowing beneath holiday lights. Across town, Daniel read the announcement from his office computer. The headline appeared on multiple business websites. Accompanying each article was a photograph of Claire standing confidently outside company headquarters. Daniel leaned back in his chair and smiled. Not because he felt surprised anymore, because he did not. Months earlier, the promotion might have seemed impossible. Now it felt inevitable. He remembered the woman he married. Intelligent, driven, determined. Somewhere along the way, both of them lost sight of that reality. Yet now the entire business world seemed to see it clearly. Later that night, Claire stood alone inside her office overlooking Manhattan. Snow drifted gently beyond the windows. The city stretched endlessly beneath her. She thought about Eleanor, about the library, about the letter, about every difficult conversation they had shared throughout the years. A framed photograph rested on the corner of her desk. Mother and daughter standing together beside a sailboat many summers ago. Claire picked it up and smiled softly. "You knew, did you not?" she whispered. The city offered no answer. Only reflections dancing across the glass. Yet somehow she felt as though her mother had answered long ago. Not through words. Through trust. Through preparation. Through believing in her even during moments when Claire doubted herself. She returned the photograph to the desk and looked out across the skyline once more. The future stretched before her like the city itself. Vast. Uncertain. Full of possibility. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt completely ready for it. January arrived with record cold temperatures across much of the Northeast. Snow covered rooftops throughout Manhattan, softening the sharp edges of the city skyline. Inside Whitmore Capital Group, however, momentum continued building. Claire's appointment as chief executive officer had generated significant attention throughout the financial industry. Investors expressed confidence. Business publications praised the company's stability. Employees seemed energized by the direction of the organization. Yet the achievement Claire valued most could not be measured by stock performance or quarterly reports. It was the simple fact that she no longer felt the need to prove herself every time she entered a room. One Friday evening, after an unusually long week of meetings, Claire left headquarters later than expected. The city streets below glittered beneath fresh snow. Holiday decorations had finally disappeared, replaced by the practical rhythm of a new year. Her driver had the evening off, so she decided to walk several blocks before calling a car. The cold air felt refreshing, liberating. Sometimes the city made more sense when experienced on foot. People hurried along sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Taxi horns echoed between buildings. Life moved forward. As Claire turned a corner near Bryant Park, she noticed a familiar figure standing outside a small bookstore cafe. Daniel. He was holding a paper cup of coffee and staring through the window at customers browsing shelves inside. For a moment, neither moved. Then Daniel smiled. "Claire." She returned the smile. "Daniel." The encounter felt surprisingly natural. No awkwardness. No tension. Just two people who once shared a life and now occupied different chapters. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air between them. "What are the odds?" Daniel asked. Claire glanced toward the bookstore. "Probably higher in Manhattan than people think." He laughed. The sound felt genuine. They stood quietly for a moment before Daniel gestured toward the cafe entrance. "Would you like to come inside for a few minutes? It is freezing out here." Claire considered the invitation. Years ago, she would have immediately said no. Not out of anger. Out of self-preservation. Tonight felt different. All right. Inside, the cafe was warm and inviting. Shelves filled with books stretched along exposed brick walls. Soft music played overhead. The scent of coffee and old paper created an atmosphere that encouraged conversation. They found a table near the back corner. For a while, they discussed ordinary things. Work, travel, books, the weather. Topics that once would have felt impossible between them. Eventually, the conversation slowed. Daniel stared briefly at the steam rising from his coffee cup. "I owe you something." Claire raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" Daniel looked up. His expression remained calm. Honest. A real apology. Claire said nothing. She simply listened. Daniel continued. "Not for the marriage ending. Some things were broken on both sides. He paused. But for the assumptions I made. Claire remained quiet. Daniel took a slow breath. I spent years seeing what I expected to see instead of what was actually there. The bookstore remained peaceful around them. Customers turned pages. Cups clinked softly against saucers. Life continued uninterrupted while something important unfolded at their small table. Daniel shook his head. I told myself stories about who you were. He smiled sadly. And eventually, I believed them. Claire looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. We all do that sometimes. Maybe. Daniel nodded. But not all of us get confronted with proof that we were wrong. The honesty in his voice carried no self-pity. No attempt to seek forgiveness. Only accountability. Claire respected that. For years she imagined what this conversation might feel like. She assumed it would bring satisfaction, closure, vindication. Instead it brought something unexpected. Peace. Thank you, she said quietly. Daniel smiled faintly. You are welcome. Another comfortable silence settled between them. Outside, snow continued falling beyond the cafe windows. The city lights reflected softly against the white-covered sidewalks. Finally, Daniel leaned back in his chair. You know what is strange? Claire smiled. What? The person everyone is talking about now. He gestured vaguely. The executive. The leader. The woman running one of the most successful firms in the city. Claire laughed softly. What about her? Daniel smiled. She is exactly the same person I met all those years ago. Claire considered the statement. Perhaps he was right. The difference was not who she had become. The difference was that people were finally seeing her clearly. Eventually they stood and prepared to leave. Outside the cafe, the cold air greeted them once more. Snow covered the streets in a quiet blanket of white. Daniel extended his hand. Claire looked at it for a moment before shaking it. Such a simple gesture. Yet somehow it carried years of history. Take care, Claire. You too, Daniel. He walked one direction. She walked another. Neither looked back. Neither needed to. As Claire continued toward the avenue, she felt lighter than she had in years. Not because someone apologized. Not because the past had changed. Because she no longer carried it. Above her, snow drifted through the glow of streetlights. Around her, the city moved forward. And for perhaps the first time since the end of her marriage, Claire realized she was doing the same. By early spring, the city had begun shedding the last signs of winter. Snowbanks disappeared from street corners. Trees lining Manhattan's avenues showed the first hints of green. The air felt lighter, softer, as though the city itself had decided to start over. Claire noticed the change one morning while standing in her office before sunrise. The skyline stretched endlessly beyond the glass. For months, she had arrived before dawn and left long after sunset. Yet today she found herself lingering beside the window with a cup of coffee, simply watching the city wake up. 6 months had passed since the funeral. 6 months since Eleanor's final letter changed the direction of her life. The grief remained. Some losses never fully disappeared. But grief had transformed into something gentler now. Less like a wound, more like a companion. A reminder of love that once existed. Whitmore Capital Group continued thriving. New investments performed beyond expectations. Employee satisfaction reached record levels. Several industry publications named the company one of the most respected firms in the region. Yet the accomplishments that brought Claire the greatest satisfaction rarely appeared in financial reports. They appeared in people. Young analysts receiving opportunities they deserved. Employees finding mentors. Teams working together instead of competing against one another. She often remembered something Eleanor used to say. Businesses are built with numbers. Legacies are built with people. One Friday afternoon, Claire left the office early. A rare event. Her destination surprised even her. The Whitmore estate. She had not spent much time there in recent months. Life became busy. Responsibilities multiplied. Yet something had been pulling her back. The drive along the shoreline felt familiar. Comforting. By the time she arrived, the property looked entirely different than it had on the day of the funeral. Spring sunlight illuminated the stone facade. Flower beds had begun blooming. The water beyond the estate sparkled beneath a cloudless sky. The house no longer felt haunted by grief. It felt alive again. Claire entered through the front door and moved quietly through the rooms. Memories greeted her everywhere. Childhood photographs, family vacations, holiday gatherings, moments frozen in time. Eventually, she found herself standing inside the library, the same room where everything changed. The same room where assumptions unraveled. The same room where Eleanor's final words reached beyond loss and into truth. Claire walked toward the desk and opened one of the drawers. Inside rested dozens of notebooks her mother had kept over the years. Journals, planning documents, personal reflections. She selected one at random and opened it carefully. The pages revealed notes from nearly 15 years earlier, meeting summaries, business ideas, personal observations. Then she found something unexpected, a short handwritten entry dated years before her marriage to Daniel. The words were simple. Claire has always been stronger than she realizes. One day she will stop seeking permission from the world. When that day arrives, nothing will limit her. Claire smiled softly. It felt exactly like something Eleanor would write. Honest, perceptive, slightly frustrating. She carried the journal to the terrace overlooking Long Island Sound and sat outside beneath the afternoon sun. Waves rolled gently toward shore. Seagulls drifted across the horizon. For the first time in months, there was no schedule waiting for her. No board meeting. No investor call. Just stillness. She spent hours reading. Page after page revealed different versions of her mother. The executive, the mentor, the friend, the parent. Some entries made her laugh. Others brought tears she no longer felt compelled to hide. By sunset, Claire closed the journal and stared out across the water. The sky glowed with shades of orange and gold. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. She was 12 years old, sitting on this very terrace. Eleanor had pointed toward the horizon and asked a question. What matters more, being understood or understanding yourself? At the time, Claire thought it was a strange question. Now she finally understood the answer. So much of her life had been spent trying to correct perceptions, convince people, defend herself, explain who she was. The inheritance, the investigation, the truth revealed in the library. None of it changed her. It simply exposed what had always been there. The strength her mother recognized long before anyone else did. As darkness slowly settled over the water, Claire stood and prepared to leave. Before returning inside, she paused one final time. The estate behind her represented history, family, legacy, the life she came from. The road ahead represented possibility, growth, the life she was still creating. For years, she believed those two things existed in conflict with one another. Now she understood they never had. She smiled toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond the fading sunlight, beyond grief and misunderstanding and old assumptions, peace had been waiting for her all along. And finally, she was ready to embrace it. 1 year later, spring returned to New York with the same quiet confidence it always seemed to carry. Trees blossomed throughout the city. Sidewalk cafes filled with conversation. Sunlight lingered longer each evening, painting glass towers in shades of gold and amber. From the top floor of Whitmore Capital Group, the skyline stretched endlessly beneath a clear afternoon sky. The office looked different now, not because the furniture had changed, because the energy had changed. The company had grown stronger over the past year. New initiatives flourished. Employee development programs expanded. Community partnerships Eleanor once dreamed about had become reality. Yet what made Claire proudest was something far less visible. People trusted one another here. They believed in the culture being built. And that, she knew, mattered more than any quarterly report. Claire stood beside the window holding a cup of coffee as she reviewed preparations for the company's annual leadership gathering. Executives, employees, investors, and community partners would be attending. Nearly 500 people were expected. The event was scheduled to begin that evening in a ballroom overlooking the Hudson River. A year ago, the idea of standing before such a crowd would have felt intimidating. Today it felt natural. Not because she had become fearless, because she finally understood that leadership was not about being the smartest person in the room. It was about helping others believe in what was possible. The ballroom sparkled beneath elegant lighting as guests arrived later that evening. Conversations filled the space. Music drifted softly through the air. Large windows revealed the river beyond, where the final colors of sunset reflected across the water. Claire moved through the crowd greeting employees and partners. Many shared stories about projects completed during the year. Others introduced family members. The atmosphere felt warm rather than formal, successful rather than extravagant. Exactly what she hoped it would become. Near one of the windows, she noticed a familiar face. Daniel. He was attending as a guest of one of the firm's community partners. Their eyes met across the room. Both smiled. Nothing dramatic. Nothing complicated. Just mutual respect. Daniel approached and extended his hand. Congratulations. Claire laughed softly. For what? He gestured around the ballroom. All of this. Claire glanced across the room. Employees laughing together. Young professionals discussing future plans. Senior leaders mentoring newer team members. It was never just me. Daniel nodded. I know. His expression carried a quiet sincerity that no longer surprised her. The past year had changed both of them. Not into different people. Into more honest versions of themselves. They spoke briefly before returning to separate conversations. Neither felt the need to revisit old wounds. The past had finally settled where it belonged. As the evening progressed, Claire stepped onto the stage to address the audience. Applause filled the ballroom. Hundreds of faces looked toward her. Some knew her story. Most only knew the leader standing before them now. Claire paused for a moment and looked across the room. Then she began speaking. Not about profits. Not about market performance. Not about business strategy. She spoke about resilience. About character. About the importance of refusing to let other people's assumptions determine your future. She spoke about growth. About second chances. About the quiet strength required to remain true to yourself when the world misunderstands you. The audience listened carefully. Some smiled. Others nodded. A few wiped away tears. Claire never mentioned Eleanor by name. She did not need to. Every lesson she shared carried traces of her mother's influence. When the speech ended, the ballroom erupted into applause. Claire smiled and stepped away from the podium. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversations and celebration. Eventually, the event drew to a close. Guests departed. Lights dimmed. The city beyond the windows shimmered beneath the night sky. Claire remained behind after everyone else left. Alone beside the glass overlooking the river. The room had grown quiet. Peaceful. She reached into her purse and removed a folded piece of paper. The final note she discovered in Eleanor's journal months earlier. She had carried it with her ever since. The words were simple. One day she will stop seeking permission from the world. When that day arrives, nothing will limit her. Claire smiled softly. For years she thought victory would feel like proving people wrong. She thought justice would feel loud, dramatic, triumphant. Instead, it felt like this. A quiet room. A peaceful heart. A future no longer shaped by old misunderstandings. Outside, lights reflected across the Hudson River. Inside, Claire folded the note carefully and returned it to her purse. Then she looked toward the city one final time before leaving the ballroom. A year earlier, people expected grief. They expected weakness. They expected tears. What they never expected was the truth. And in the end, the truth changed far more than an inheritance. It changed the lives of everyone who finally chose to see it. Claire walked toward the exit without looking back. She did not need to. The past was behind her. The future was waiting. And for the first time in a very long time, she walked toward it completely free.